Well, later tonight, the US President Donald Trump will sit down with Russian leader Vladimir Putin for 90 minutes without advisers and only interpreters present. Putin has been the president for the best part of 20 years, Trump less than 18 months, yet the American spent the days leading up to the summit playing golf and in one notable interview listed the EU as among America's greatest foes, doubling down on his earlier claim that meeting Putin will be easier than meeting his NATO allies. Sebastian Gorka is a former high-level advisor to President Trump. He joined me earlier from Washington. Dr. Gorka, you know Mr. Trump, you served him in the White House. Do you think he understands that he's potentially at a deep disadvantage in meeting Mr. Putin without officials, without agenda and really without serious preparation?
I am not worried about what the president will be doing with Vladimir Putin. He wrote the book, The Art of the Deal. He is the arch negotiator. If anybody can get something positive out of a meeting with a former KGB colonel, it is Donald J. Trump.
It's been suggested Mr. Putin could pull out maps of Crimea, say, or Ukraine and say, well, let's put a permanent border here or here. Would Mr. Trump understand the implications of doing a deal like that?
Sorry, are you just going to pull out weird scenarios from thin air? We could talk about how Vladimir Putin could invite him to play croquet in St. Petersburg.
But there's no formal agenda for the meeting, Dr. Gorka. Why wouldn't Mr. Putin try that, given there is no agenda?
Because he's not a stupid man. And he realizes that Donald Trump is the most powerful man in the world. And you don't create a positive relationship at any level, by starting it with something as aggressive as that. So, no, I don't expect him to be pulling out maps of Crimea.
Mr. Trump says he'll raise the issue of Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And yet he says of the indictment of the 12 Russian intelligence officers, it's a witch hunt and it will damage efforts to improve relations with Russia. Doesn't that signal to Putin, look, you needn't take my inquiries about this too seriously?
A, it's not his inquiries. It's the DOJ. It's not Donald Trump's inquiries. And B, he wants to try and improve, if possible, relations with Russia. Remember, this is a nation with 11 time zones, with nuclear weapons, that sits on the UN Security Council with a veto vote, and which is a destabilizing force, not just in Eastern Europe, but around the world. So the idea that you don't meet with him, the idea that you provoke him unnecessarily, is not very wise geopolitically. I have no love lost for Moscow. My father was imprisoned and tortured by communist secret police officers. But at the end of the day, even Churchill worked with Stalin, and guess what? Ronald Reagan sat down with Gorbachev. So it's not as if Donald Trump invented the idea of talking to Russian or Soviet heads of state.
Do you think when Mr. Trump goes into the meeting and says, look, Mr. Putin, before we go any further, I just want to raise with you the audacious covert operation to disrupt the US elections, Mr. Putin's really going to take him seriously, given that the US president says that inquiries into that matter are a witch hunt?
Anybody who doesn't take Donald J. Trump seriously does so at their own peril. This is not a president to be trifled with. Whether you're a KGB colonel, or whether you're the leader of North Korea, or whether you're anybody else.
It's a tough conversation, yeah?
It will be a tough conversation. These are both alpha males. They're both powerful individuals, although the Russia of today is a shadow of the Soviet Union. But it will be a serious conversation between serious men.
And yet he says, thinking of this tough conversation he has with Putin, that it's actually an easier discussion than talking to NATO or talking to the British.
No, I agree. I agree it is. For the last generation, NATO has been a lot of talk and not a lot of seriousness. There's been a lot of lovely protocol discussions and not talking candidly about real issues, like the fact that 80% of NATO members don't keep their promises to pay for their own defense and are freeloaders. So I don't think you'll have a lot of needless protocol between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
See, that seems extraordinary to me, that it's easier to talk to Mr Putin about his annexation of Crimea, about his support for the Syrian tyrant Bashar al-Assad, about the fact that Russia supplied weapons to shoot down MH17, about the fact that Russian agents have taken Novichok into the UK and accidentally killed an innocent civilian. That's an easier conversation than talking about defence budgets.
Why are you so adamant at being critical of the president? I mean, I thought you're a journalist. Why don't you approach this with at least one positive question or one thing that is constructive?
You see, I think anybody watching from home would think, well, you're going to walk into a meeting with a group of Europeans who've been your allies in the First World War, the Second World War, the establishment of the liberal world order. You're in an alliance with them called NATO, and you're having an arm wrestle over defence budgets versus mano a mano with President Putin. When you've got these incredibly difficult issues to discuss, we'd be interested in your view as an insider as to why the Putin discussion would be the easier conversation to have.
Very simply, because it's not covered in a layer of empty verbiage and political correctness. When Europe denies the crisis in front of it with regards to immigration, terrorism, spending, it's very difficult to have meaningful conversations with people who, yes, on paper are our allies, but in many ways don't behave like that.
And finally, so what do you think will come out of this summit?
I'm very skeptical that a former KGB colonel will suddenly behave like a normal head of state. My minimum expectation is that he will leave that summit with Donald Trump understanding that what he did in Ukraine is wrong, and we will not countenance any more territorial ambitions being realized through the use of military force or subversion. And at the very, very least, I hope that his meddling in Syria will stop, and potentially we will see a Russian withdrawal from the theater in Syria. I really don't expect anything much more than that, because at the end of the day, he's a former KGB colonel.
Dr. Gorka, thank you so much for your time, for that spirited discussion. I enjoyed it very much.
Me too.